Hi, everybody, and a huge welcome. It's great to have so many of you joining us today. My name is Jen Barker. I work for Ormiston Academies Trust, and I think it's really telling actually that we've got so many people who have signed up and are filtering in for today's session. There's a huge amount of interest, I think, and appetite to be involved in and to learn and develop and better understand what we mean by effective inclusive practice. Many of you will be aware of lots of the challenges that we are experiencing with the system that supports our most vulnerable learners. It's not working, I think, arguably for lots of pupils, despite the enormous amounts of effort that are going into it. I think it's experienced as quite adversarial, as quite time consuming and slow by parents and families who need to be involved. And it's also leading, I think, to increasing levels of disempowerment for many of the educators who are working incredibly hard to support pupils with SEND. And so today we're going to be thinking a bit about how we can intervene, how we can address this. And this is where inclusion in practice comes in. So Inclusion in Practice is an initiative which has run alongside the work of the Expert Advisory Group for Inclusion, which itself is an independent advisory group providing expert advice to government on how to improve mainstream education for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. And Inclusion in Practice itself is a sector-led initiative which is designed to capture examples of practice which deepen our understanding of what really successful inclusion looks like. And it recently ran a call for evidence which surfaced 5 insights, and these were knowing children well, early and often. We all agree that children should receive appropriate early intervention, and that comes from knowing our pupils really well. Secondly, high quality and evidence informed teaching practice. So pupils with additional learning needs benefit more than all pupils, I think, from high quality teaching. Thirdly, coherent and expert targeted support. So ensuring that we are able to support children in the right place with the right support, ideally in their classroom, in their local school. Strengthening inclusion through relationships and partnerships. We know that it's only possible to make progress if we work in close partnership with families, teachers and experts, and viewing inclusion as a shared and strategic responsibility. We know that leadership makes a huge difference to the quality of schools, and seeing our provision for pupils with SEND as integrated into this and not as something which is additional to and different from is really important. And today we're going to be focusing on Insight 2. And I'm delighted to be able to be joined by 3 people who I know are thinking incredibly deeply about this. And I'm going to come to them now and ask them to say a few words about what they do and what they have been thinking about when it comes to effective inclusive practice. So Rachel, can I start with you?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Stevenson. I'm Head of SEND at Reach 2 Academy Trust. So we are a primary-only MAT across the country. And I've been in the role since January 2022. And in that time, we've developed our STEM strategy, really thinking about how we can support our schools, SENCOs, with inclusive teaching and just the challenges we face in the national SEND system.
Great, thank you. Kathy. Oh, you're on mute.
Hi, I was doing so well to make sure I was muted for your introduction. That's not helping. I work with Rachel at Reach 2. I'm the chief exec there. We've got 62, soon to be 65 primaries right across the country. We've got 12 designated SRPs with catering for needs of children, speech and language, autism, and one of our schools has got a school for the deaf attached to it, and then an increasing number of enhanced provision resource spaces for children. So it's really great to be here and great to see so many people logged in.
Lovely, thank you. And Pat, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My name's Peps, and I am the Director of Education at Step Lab. We are currently working on a bit of a project with Ormiston and Jen to try and codify what effective provision looks like in the SEND context. And I have always been interested in the evidence, and in particular, more recently have become interested in the evidence around how we can better support our most vulnerable students. And that's hopefully what we will talk a little bit more about today.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It's brilliant to have you all here. So we're going to spend the next probably 25 minutes discussing various aspects and issues related to what we think constitutes, effective practice, effective inclusive practice. And then we're going to go to some questions from you guys, from our audience. So please do use the Q&A function to share your questions if you've got them. We will get to as many of those as we can. We probably won't be able to get to them, get to all of them, but please do make a note if there's anything that you would like to put to our panelists. So first up, perhaps I'm going to come to you, if that's okay. And your question is, what does the evidence tell us about how important this topic is, and how can we think smarter about inclusive teaching?
Right, so very big question, Jay. What does the evidence tell us about this very complex thing? But yes, let's see what we can do in, I'll give myself about 6 minutes on the clock. So first off, just to say that the evidence base is fairly mixed when it comes to SEND provision. There are some kind of like pockets of decent evidence, and then there's a whole bunch of like pockets of like less robust evidence. And really, we have to take a big step back and try to join the dots across as many of these evidence bases as possible, and to like try and theorize what's going on if we're going to kind of work our way through this very complex, highly messy situation. And so I'm going to talk about kind of 3 ways we can think about that evidence. Firstly, how it can make sure that we're confident that there really is an issue that we have to, address. Secondly, how we might best think about some of those issues, like what causes some of the problems we are encountering. And then thirdly, like theoretically, what we might try to do as schools to play our part in like dealing with the problem, as it were, or dealing with the challenges. So what does the evidence tell us about the situation? Well, firstly, it confirms that really the outcomes for students with SEND really are not good enough. Attainment gaps are pretty persistent, although they are shrinking slightly over time. But essentially, they increase from about a 1-year gap to a 2-year gap between age 5 and key stage 4. And students with SEND are 5 times more likely to be excluded, and they report lower levels of well-being and belonging. So outcomes aren't good enough. In addition, we know that the kind of lack of capacity across the system is a bit of an issue. Although like EHCPs do act as a bit of a gateway to access to resources, there are also quite lengthy processes often to achieve that kind of support, and which creates lots of stress for families and children. And I think only half of new EHCPs were issued within the 20-week limit in 2023, which really isn't kind of good enough. And then we've got kind of inequality across this whole system as well. So basically, students in more affluent areas are more likely to, like students with SEND in more affluent areas are more likely to be able to access an EHCP. Perhaps that's kind of more like sharp elbows, perhaps that's basically like some perverse incentives in the systems, but disparities essentially exist in EHCPs, and also like exam access between independent and state schools. So there's a variety of things which maybe suggest things aren't as equitable as they could be. And then we have, increase in teacher workload, a lack of confidence in teacher confidence, lack of teacher confidence and perceived expertise in provision of SEND. Like 88% of teachers say they basically feel like they could do with more help to support students with SEND. And then, of course, we have like spiraling costs which are going out of control. Lots of you will be aware that the kind of high needs funding reached over 10 billion last year, which is like an over 50% increase in the last decade or so. Lots of councils are basically facing insolvency over this. So the problem is real, and the evidence is pretty clear that it's something that we need to do something about. Now, the evidence could also help us to understand the kind of causes of this, because it's important to understand why all this is happening if we're going to propose an effective solution. And so one of the reasons that like SEND numbers are on the rise is because of what we might call diagnostic expansion. So part of the expansion is driven by the broadening in diagnostic criteria. For example, the ASD criteria have grown in terms of what they encompass over the last 10 years or so. And this growth kind of dilutes resources across a broader range of students and compromises some of the quality of our provision. That's kind of a first angle on things. In addition, the construct validity, which is basically another word for like how well we're able to pin down these different conditions, can vary quite a lot. It's better for physical conditions and much worse for the mental conditions like ASD and SEMH and language difficulties. And that variation makes it much more difficult for us to be able to accurately deploy interventions in ways that will help students to actually overcome some of the barriers they face. And there's quite a lot of variation even between schools in terms of the identification of these different conditions. So basically this like inability to be able to pin things down, it creates a bit of a problem. And then in addition, we have this kind of concept of what we call diagnostic overshadowing, which is a concept Jen introduced me to, actually. It's a concept borrowed from the medical world, where doctors can sometimes get basically a bit like overly focused on the condition that a patient has and fail to see the actual medical need that they have. So you might have a patient that has a condition of schizophrenia, and they complain of having stomach issues, and there is evidence to suggest that a doctor might misattribute their stomach pains to their schizophrenia and misidentify that maybe they have appendicitis or something like that. And the same can happen in schools. We tend to get a little bit overly absorbed by students' ASD diagnosis and assume that all of their kind of needs are because of that, rather than the fact that they just need to be able to decode phonemes better. And then related to that is a bunch of evidence around the kind of negative impacts of labels. So labels do help us to kind of access resources and create greater attention towards certain students, but they also have negative effects, such as they can reduce teacher expectations of students, and students themselves can even lower their expectations whenever they find themselves with a label. For example, they tend to aspire to go to less prestigious universities when they find out they have a special educational need. So in short, labels are kind of a double-edged sword, and it's important that we are aware of their kind of downsides as well as their positive sides. All in all, I think when we boil down all of the evidence in terms of what it means for us in terms of inclusion, I think what it would suggest is we need to focus less on individuals and focus more on inclusion. So right at the start, when Jen talked about SEND, in the code of practice, talking about SEND being different to, in addition to, and different from, sometimes that mentality actually is counterproductive for our students. It actually works against them. And whereas instead, when we take an approach which treats or recognizes that all students have the same kind of cognitive architecture, and that the best thing we can do for pretty much every student is just to teach really effectively, then we start to create the conditions to be less individualistic and more inclusive. And I think that not only helps all our students, but it helps our most vulnerable students the most.
Great, thank you. It's good. Canter through the evidence base. And I might come back to you at this time at the end to hear some specific examples of how we can cater to groups, how we can move our shift away from individuals and think more about what inclusive practice looks like. But that was a great introduction. Thank you. Rachel, I'm going to come to you next, if that's okay. And it would be really great to hear a little bit about what effective inclusive teaching looks like in your context, and particularly what are some of the key barriers to inclusive teaching that you have experienced, and what have you done to overcome them?
Great. So I think actually my session leads on very well from what Peps has said about we need to be doing, instead of doing more and lots of different things, we need to teach better. And I'm going to share with you our work we've been doing around our adaptive teaching strategy and what that looks like within our classrooms, and share some of those tools within our toolkit you'll keep hearing me talk about that have been really effective to supporting children in the classroom. So we have the same challenges that all of teachers are facing across the country, that increasing SEND needs with potentially lots and lots of different strategies, different labels. So we've, as a trust, have really looked at our teaching pedagogy and what are the components needed for children to be successful in every lesson, ensuring those barriers to learning are identified and removed. It's not often I'd use the word Ofsted and pleased in many sentences. However, I think the new framework really does reinforce that need for that high quality, inclusive teaching where we know our children well and we teach adaptively. And I think by doing that, not using lots of different strategies, we're then also really reducing that workload. And I think for all of us on the call today, we know that's best practice and something that I'm sure you'll agree with me on, that we know when those lessons are taught well and these strategies are implemented, it's really effective for all children, but especially our SEND. So what have we done? We've split our adaptive teaching. We've done lots of research into different components, and I'm just going to share a few of them that have been really effective. So for us, we really started with culture, and I think this also links to what Peps has been saying about everyone having those high expectations, really knowing their children well, strong relationships. All of our staff had training on the Pygmalion effect and how important it is for us to truly believe that every child can achieve, not to lower any of our expectations. It always makes me wonder how children do manage to lower themselves to those. I've never quite worked that one out, but really having that high aspirations. As a trust, we no longer talk about ability because that can really be a fixed mindset, and we talk about every child as having their attainment. And getting that culture right, that inclusive culture, has been really, really key as building that strong foundation for everything that comes next through our adaptive teaching. And we have faced challenges. There have been some staff where it's been a challenge to change their mindset, but through working with leaders, reminding staff of their teaching standards, the code of practice responsibilities, we have had to persevere and take the time to work with those individuals and ultimately hold them to account, because teaching standards have been there for a long time. There's nothing new in having to adapt and support our learners, but that has been a real starting point for us, making sure the culture's right. So pre-teaching. This has been one of our most successful tools that we've used and has had a real significant impact on children's self-esteem, confidence and closing gaps to learning. So this we do prior to learning. Teachers identify who needs what. It might be they need to be exposed to key learning, to the specific vocabulary of the lesson, or to make sure they've got the experiences and the prior knowledge to be a successful learner. And we found that pre-teaching has really supported our SEND children's confidence in lessons. They're having that bit of that preview so that their self-esteem, they then know some of the answers already, they've seen these, and those factors are really motivating and are adding to our successful outcomes. Pre-teaching, I can't recommend enough. We've had many advantages with it where it's used consistently. Again, challenges have been around teacher capacity, support staff, where we're seeing reducing numbers in some cases, and really tight timetables. But to overcome these, we've valued the importance and been creative and flexible and just trying to use any of those opportunities. So it might be at the end of the day, the class are reading and packing away, we'll take a group then, or in the morning, rather than doing the morning work, let's do that pre-teaching because it does have such a massive impact. Finishing 5-10 minutes early on independent work. There's lots of creative solutions to support being able to get these things into place. And where possible, the class teacher, because they're our most highly qualified person. Another aspect that we've really worked on in making sure our teachers have got in their toolkit is the assessment for learning, because without that, we don't know what the gaps are in learning. We're not identifying children that are maybe getting left behind, have got misconceptions, whatever it may be. And we do find if we're not assessing for learning regularly, children can develop misconceptions, and in some cases they can then become dysregulated and disruptive because they're unsure what's happening, and we know what can happen then. So one thing we've really focused on is hinge questions as a tool in our teacher toolkit. Hinge questions being used to check understanding before moving on in learning, or when we need to make sure that children have really understood a concept before we move on. With our hinge questions, we always offer multiple choice. because that way we're removing that barrier and that anxiety for children. There is a right answer there somewhere. And the children are all taught to show it on a whiteboard, hold fingers up, or different letters depending on the options. And within the options, it does need to be carefully thought about by teachers, because you can give a plausible distractor within there. So there's answers that would be a misconception that the teacher can then identify. And we have actually found the use of AI really, really supportive in creating hinge questions. So they're kind of our three top tips so far that we found really impactful within our adaptive teaching strategy. And then to support our staff, because as Pep said, about the 80% of staff don't feel they have the knowledge. Over the last 18 months, we've been developing, writing and delivering what we call our bite-sized training sessions. And these have really been specific to areas of need to give our teachers, TAs, SENCOs, the tools they need to feel more confident and knowledgeable in supporting various SEND needs within their classroom. And we found that this training has been disappearing or is non-existent in some local authorities anymore. And there was a real gap in that teacher knowledge or support staff, whoever's working with our children. We've seen lots of these strategies used within classrooms, and it's having a real positive impact. The sessions are all live, but we also record them and make sure they can be accessed at any time on our intranets. And actually the recordings are accessed far more than the attendance at the live sessions, but that's not a problem. It's when people need them, they can get it, it's there for them. And where it works really well is SENCOs adapting that training to the needs of their team or to directing staff directly to it. We've kept it simple, user-friendly as much as possible, and they're short, informative. And our real focus has been on giving our staff the tools to work with children, so that they're not having to kind of sit through hours of training and sometimes it's cognitive overload. We've got the main bits. So a real successful one, for example, supporting our children with writing who are struggling, where we'd model a range of scaffolds, including like voice recordings, assistive technology, cut up sentences, color coded sentences, pencil grips, all those high quality strategies that we can put in place to remove those barriers for children. We also might do topics on emotional based school avoidance, escalation curve, a whole range of different needs that we've covered. And the model has been keep it simple so that we get the most out of the session and people can take away those tools to put into the classroom straight away. And we have found that that has really empowered staff, their confidence has grown, and they feel their well-being has massively increased as well. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. And it feels like some robust strategies that are simultaneously saving people's time, but also ensuring that you're not reducing the rigor of the content and the curriculum that you're exposing children to, which I think also is a really is going to be a really important feature of the work that we do, so that pupils with additional needs don't sort of become at risk of falling further and further behind. We've had a couple of questions that are sort of digging into some of the specific techniques, which we might come back to if we've got time. But before we do that, Kathy, I'm going to come to you if that's okay. And it would be great to hear from you how we can ensure a school or a trust workforce are given the relevant, timely, really high quality development opportunities in support of meeting the needs of all pupils.
I guess I start from the perspective that a great school, if it's going to be a great school, can only be a great school if it's great for every child. And that's a really big ask. And it's a really big ambition of pretty much every teacher I speak to, is that the needs of the children who are most vulnerable sometimes feel like they're the hardest children to support and families that we most need to reach. So we all want our schools, whether that's an individual school, a standalone trust, or a trust that, like ours, as a family of schools, we all want the best thing for everybody, and we want each school to be a place where there's remarkable learning going on, because the remarkable people feel empowered to be able to do the thing that they are trained to do. So I guess from the Pepsi's comment about like perceived expertise, I suppose we've come at this in kind of 3 buckets. The first one is that we need to try and stop seeing SEND as a binary choice. You're a child with SEND or you're not a child with SEND, and instead see that there is a range of need, and actually reminding teachers that they and support staff that they do know what they're doing. And I think there has been a risk over recent years that we sort of pathologize children, and perhaps even overstate what is needed. And what that does is it just disempowers teachers from thinking they know what they're doing. But in actual fact, as Rachel said, great teaching is great teaching for all children, including and most of all for children with SEND. And so the perspective that we've come at in Reach 2 is to try and sort of leverage training for everybody, because in staff surveys, the time that I spend in school talking to teachers and leaders and support staff and parents, and it's the #1 worry of every head teacher that I've spoken to in Reach 2. If you ask what are the 3 things that will wake you up in the night, meeting the needs of children with SEND, with the greater complexity, the funding issues that Peps has talked about, and then with all of that pain, the children don't do very well at the end of it anyway, with quite a painful experience for families to boot. It's no wonder that that comes out as the top worry for everybody. So as a trust, we launched what we called our Great School Strategy in 2022, and that had within it a strategy for SEND that Rachel's referred to, and then a really comprehensive training plan, so that every teacher and every member of the support staff right across the trust has accessed during regular staff meeting time the training that Rachel has described. That we have cluster SENCO meetings as well. So that again is about empowering the SENCOs within each school, so that they are then able to do that bespoke training that Rachel's spoken about, being able to go to the training that's available and say, well, we think this child needs block therapy, there's a training session on that. We've got girls with ASD, that's a different skill set sometimes in working with girls. Attachment and trauma trainings. So there's hopefully something there that people can just draw upon. But we're coming at that, and these are not hard numbers, that they won't be true of every class, but we're coming at this from the point of view that the adaptations made to teaching, that a bit like when drop curbs were introduced for wheelchair users, actually drop curbs are good for everybody. They're good for people with bikes, they're good for people with pushchairs, they're good for anybody, because you don't just trip up a high curb. So those adaptations that are being made are good for all children, not just children with SEND. We've come at that training from the perspective that that will work for 28 out of 30 children in the class, that it is actually a very small minority of children that are going to need to draw upon some of the more specialist training that we've talked about. And what we're finding is a combination of that for our staff in schools, supported by a really strong underpinning in teacher training, because what we want is teachers coming into schools feeling already super empowered to be able to meet the needs of children. I think when I did my training, there was like a day or something on SEND. That is absolutely not the case now. And in our skit, as in initial teacher training right across the country, big emphasis on empowering teachers to be able to meet children's needs from the get-go. So strong underpinning for skit, strong underpinning for teachers in their early career part of their training, and then all staff. And what we've seen, as Rachel has said, is a real greater sense of now the expertise and empowerment seems to be more in line with teachers' passion, because there was never any lack of that before. There was never any lack of passion for working with children who find learning more difficult. There was never any lack of will. In fact, the more Senkos I talk to, the more they speak about, they use the word love all the time. This is a deep mission to work with children and to ensure they succeed. But we now feel like there's an empowerment and an expertise that is sitting alongside that heart work, which is leaving people in a much better place to support the children.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. It feels like something that you thought incredibly deeply about. We've had a few questions come in, which is great. I'm going to start with a question for Peps on a term that Ed has heard you use, which is embrace cognitive similarity. So that's what I'll come to you first, just to give a very, very brief explanation of what that means. And then Rachel, if it's okay, I'm going to come to you to hear a little bit more on what you feel has been the sort of the highest leverage sort of techniques that you've used to support all pupils. If you could say anything about pre-teaching, that would be great. We've had a question about pre-teaching as well, and which are the topics in the bite-sized sessions that you've run with teaching assistants that you think have been most impactful. And then we've also got a question about the role of the local authority, which Rachel, I might start with you and see if anybody has got some other thoughts on. So perhaps over to you to start with, please.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Good question. So earlier on, when we talked about this idea of like focusing less on individuals and more on inclusion, really one of the reasons that that's a better bet is because the science helps us to understand that the way we learn, and when I say we, I mean both adults and children, including children and adults with special educational needs, is ultimately much more similar than it is different. So, for example, we all, whilst there is a bit like small variation in our working memory capacities, like how much we're able to pay attention to and think about it at any given moment, we all benefit from strategies which try to reduce that cognitive load. And so, we see this time and time again when we look at the research around effective teaching. Often what the kind of findings say is that this strategy, which works for everyone, such as clear structures and routines, such as explicit teaching, such as lots of retrieval practice, helps everyone, and it seems to help the most vulnerable students even more. So there's kind of like an increased sensitivity to those students. Essentially, our most vulnerable students, those with SEND, benefit the most from good teaching and lose out the most from the worst teaching. And so this idea of cognitive similarity pushes us less away from organizing our instruction and schooling around individual deficits and more towards organizing our instruction around common cognitive architecture, around what we know around how students learn. And that's all of that stuff that you already know about what effective teaching looks like, explaining things clearly, breaking stuff down, providing clear examples and models, providing lots of opportunities for practice with feedback and retrieval practice over time.
Great, thank you. Rachel, over to you.
I think, again, that follows nicely from what Pet said with our quickest and easiest wins. Obviously, with adaptive teaching, there's lots to it and it isn't something you can quickly plug. However, my quickest one, and one that we'd put in first if we were to do our time again, would be around that assessing learning, and the hinge questions especially, because unless we know what children young adults can't do, and we're not checking up on how they're keeping up with our modelling, our teaching, our direct teaching, how can we then adapt in the moment? How can we then know if we need to remodel something, rephrase the way we're doing something? So for me, that's one of those quickest ones, finding out your teachers being able to identify who needs what. And we do see that quite commonly, that's one of the things that's sometimes missing. You could have a great teaching pedagogy, but without that, how do we know what they need from us in the moment? And then just the one about pre-teaching in secondary. So things like getting the children together at the end of the lesson, towards the end of the lesson, the teacher pulling out, just come and have a chat with me. This is what we're going to be doing next lesson. Here's some key vocab, whatever that might be. And just trying to build that into the lesson structure where possible. And also, I know for lots of you in secondaries, you may have kind of nurture areas. If you've got SEND children going there, sending that over to the teams, working with them so that they've got practical tasks they can be doing and helping in that pre-teaching in that moment. I think I've got lots to cover. I'm conscious of time. I think there was one around inclusion's often talked about in relation to high instance SEND. I think that's where the adaptive teaching is focusing on everybody. And that's why we really want to focus on that one. I think for us, lots of us, we're doing something very, very different for our real high and complex need children, like that we're not covering today. That is something we can get right for everyone. And then with our bite size, sorry, there's lots of questions that have come my way. With the bite size sessions, things that have been really impactful have been understanding ADHD and how to support children in the classroom, the same as we've had an autism session, but also a girls with autism, so that we can really spot how they might be presenting and what we can do about that with or without a diagnosis. Within our trust, we always look at what are the needs that are presenting and how can we be creative and think outside of the box to support our children. And our bite-sized sessions are doing just that. They're giving different ways of thinking and supporting. One that's has been really useful is the one I shared around developing independence with children who are struggling with their writing. So often I see them copy off a whiteboard and it's just a copying skill, whereas actually those strategies we've now seen staff working with children, they are then becoming independent, they're doing a cut up sentence or they've got a sentence starter, they're recording on a sound button, and that's then removing that reliance on an additional adult or the teacher all the time as well, and we're getting them to feel confident to become more and more independent, which is our ultimate goal.
Yeah, and also ensuring that curriculum rigor is still really present as well, which I really like.
Yeah.
Rachel, do you have anything that you would add on the relationship that you have with the local authority, and whether what sort of role they play in your experience or have played most helpfully?
That one's a little tricky. I work with 18, 19, I think, different local authorities, and it does vary as to the support. I think in some cases, there is still support for inclusive teaching and developing workforce. However, in other areas, this is what my role is becoming, to support and to fill that gap where there isn't. I'm also a governor for a maintained school, and the support around kind of teaching and learning and ensuring that what's going on for SEND children in the classroom is incredibly limited. But that's just my experience and with the local authorities I work with.
Yeah. And we'll final kind of couple of questions, which Kathy, I'm going to put to you if that's okay. So we've had one about pupil voice and how this gets kind of played into the provision that we shape for pupils with additional needs. And also it would be great to hear a little bit more about how you kind of foster and cultivate relationships with parents who we know often experience this as an enormous sort of challenge and something which can be very frustrating and sort of anxiety inducing. So yeah, talk to us a little bit about student voice and about how you build really sort of strong and effective relationships with parents, and then we'll come to a sort of a panelist recommendation for some future reading people can take away.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the place to end, because children have got a lot to say about what works and what doesn't work for them, and we do well to listen to that. I mean, in Reach 2 we've got formal ways of doing that through pupil council, cluster councils with groups of schools, and pupil parliament debating various different issues. But I think in terms of the realm we're talking about today, having children's voice at the heart of decisions that are made, asking children questions about what works and what doesn't, when do they feel that they're thriving, when do they feel afraid, getting underneath the skin of their day-to-day experience. We have members of our leadership teams in schools that actually almost like shadow a child who with identified SEND throughout the course of the day, to see what their experiences are like when you put the day together. And sometimes children have more so many more transitions, so many more different adults, such a confusing timetable that it's not surprised at points in the day that it all starts to feel a bit overwhelming. So seeing everything through the lens of a child, rather than, which I know sounds like the opposite of what Pep said around not speaking about the individual but inclusion. I think it's an and both conversation. It's from the point of view of teaching, seeing what works for a child with SEND works for every child. It's also looking at the world through the eyes of an individual child with that sort of empathy to walk a mile in their shoes. And I think that then becomes very much the basis of how we want, all of us in schools want to work with parents. The personal journey that parents go through to try to get their children's needs met is perilously difficult, extremely stressful, full of surprise and not the good kind, a lot of heartache, and there's a great vulnerability around that for many parents. We also know that if there's a topic that parents are going to get irate about and potentially sort of let off steam, it's very often around children who are identified with SEND. So it is a difficult one. We're doing work with Reach 2 leaders about how we build positive relationships with parents, and some absolutely beautiful examples from schools across the country, not just in our trust, but in maintained schools, standalone trusts and smaller trusts, of the way in which schools really do see themselves as being in partnership with parents. And I think where we get that partnership right, then the child flourishes. It's when energy becomes diffused by a kind of push-pull going on that the child falls down the middle of that. So, I mean, the work of Parent Kind is absolutely brilliant in this space. Again, trying to bridge that gap between school and home where it does need to be bridged. But it is very much keeping the child and the family at the heart of everything. And I think particularly in primary, we very much work on the basis of John West Burnham's research around the role of family in primary education. And his research said this: up to the age of 12, the family is 7 times more influential than school. So if we don't embrace working with parents as partners, we are really hugely missing large swathes of what a child's experience are. So we haven't touched on it very much today, but things like attendance of children with SEND is a prime place to begin, where building that partnership, trying to break down those barriers that stop children with SEND from attending school regularly, the rise of elective home education. This is the big space we're working in, and it's hard, but it's the right thing to be doing.
Yeah. Great, thank you so much. We have covered an awful lot of ground, and I suspect we could probably all hang around and talk about this for quite some time. A few things to, and I'm gonna come to each panelist and ask them to share some sort of follow-up reading for individuals who want to sort of continue to explore and think about this. A couple of things to say though. Firstly, that the next webinar is going to be about engagement with parents, families and the local authority. So you've given you a small amount of information, but this is obviously something which deserves its own session. So please do look out for that and join if that's something that you're particularly interested in. And we will share the recording of this session as well. So if there's anything that you want to go back to, you'll be able to do that too. So before we do sort of final thank yous and finish, I'm going to come to each panelist to say a few kind of, any final reflections and closing thoughts, and also, what you think anybody who's here today should take away and read for more information. Pat, can I come to you first?
Sure. So takeaways from me are that actually, when you look at the evidence, a lot of what schools would naturally do ends up being like quite an effective approach. I think embracing cognitive similarity, embracing high quality teaching, and adapting minimally and doing what you need to do, but like not overdoing it in terms of provision, will get us a long way there. In terms of reading, there are kind of two things I'd call out. Sami Tamimi's book, Searching for Normal, is an epic read if you want to like dig into some of the kind of background issues around increasing diagnostic expansion. And if you'd like to hear more about kind of our synthesis of the evidence, Jen and I and Josh's, then this paper, Inclusive Teaching, Securing Strong Educational Outcomes and Experiences for All Students, will give you a full breakdown of that. And I'm going to post a link to that in the chat right now.
Great, thank you. Rachel, let's come to you next.
For me, the takeaways would be around taking the time to really think about your teaching pedagogy and what does teaching look like in your settings, and really thinking about what's most effective and going to have most impact without causing lots and lots of additional strategies and workload for staff, and always thinking that it's within our power to change what we can. And one of the things we can do is give our staff as much knowledge and strategies and confidence to really support our learners to the best of their ability. We've got further information on our adaptive teaching strategy and bite-size sessions within our case study on the Inclusion in Practice website. And again, I can pop a link in the chat if that helps. And I've just seen it on the screen as well.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Kathy, over to you.
I guess I would want to sort of might wrap up by saying, on a rising tide, every boat goes up, and I think that's what we've been talking about. We've been talking about there's a rising tide of great passion, empowerment, and understanding about the complexity of need that is there, and with that, and with the right training at skip level, initial teacher training, and through the early career framework, we can empower a workforce where we can match their expertise with their love for children and families with SEND, and that we, where we can, try to avoid seeing this as being a binary choice, that we look at the whole child and see that child smiling back at us, and know that we can do this.
Yeah, great. The perfect note to finish on. So I think it leaves for me to say thank you so much. First of all, to colleagues from Ambition who have hosted this and provided a lot of support to make it all run very smoothly in the background, and also obviously to Inclusion in Practice colleagues as well, ImpactEd and CST, but also a huge thank you to Kathy, Rachel and PEPS, our panellists, who have shared very generously their thoughts, their expertise, and the high quality practice that they are committing to day in and day out. Thank you so much for attending. We hope it was useful, and yeah, you can see there's the QR code to sign up to join the next webinar in the series. Apart from that, have a good rest of the day, rest of the week, and thank you again.